Welcome to MTGRecon, the show where I break down brand new precons so you know exactly what you're getting and ways you can upgrade it in the future. Today we're talking about the Commander Master precon Eldrazi Unbound. This unique precon is colorless and features an Eldrazi at the helm featuring a heavy colorless theme. But first, let's talk about the actual commander, or at least the face commander, that being Zuladoc. This is a 6-cost Eldrazi that gives all colorless spells you cast with mana value 7 or greater double cascade, meaning you get to cascade twice for every expensive colorless spell you cast. This obviously leans you towards the Eldrazi theme and getting to play really expensive artifacts, and this deck has both of those. Believe it or not, getting to cast 2 free spells every time you cast a big spell is really powerful, taking turns where you'd normally do just one big thing and turning it into a massive value play where you can often go from way behind to leading the game. But Zuladoc is just one of your options. There is another brand new commander, that being Omarthus, Ghostfire Initiate. It's XX for a legendary creature, Spirit Naga, notably not an Eldrazi, 0/0 that enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Then, whenever you put one or more +1/+1 counters on another colorless creature, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Omarthus. Then, whenever Omarthus dies, you get to manifest a number of cards from the top of your library equal to the number of counters on it. If you don't know, manifesting is when you take the card from your library, from your hand, or wherever it's coming from, and put it on the battlefield face down. Then if it's a creature, you can flip it face up anytime for its cost. If it's not a creature, it will just stay a 2/2 on the battlefield forever. While I think Omarthus is a really cool commander and one that I'm really excited to see decks built around, I don't think that this deck is necessarily built in a way where it can just slot in as the commander. There are a couple cards that care about manifesting, and there might be some counter synergies in there, but there's really not enough to get this to be powerful in the command zone. But again, it is not your only other option. There's also a reprinted legendary that is really exciting that can also be your commander. So in the deck, Kozilek the Great Distortion is a 10-cost 12/12 that when you cast it, if you have fewer than 7 cards in your hand, you get to draw cards equal to the difference. Then it has Menace, and you can discard a card with mana value X to counter target spell with mana value X. This is a really good legendary creature, but it's not anything that gives you a ton of repeatable value that you necessarily want to build your deck around. Now, if you happen to cast Kozilek while you have Zuladoc out, that's a lot of value and can really help you fill up your hand and keep going in a deck that is colorless and may struggle to draw cards, but we'll talk about that here in just a second. Now, outside of the 2 new legendaries, there are 8 other brand new cards that are sure to spice up your gameplay and make colorless decks even more powerful. I want to talk about them here because they're cards you're probably not familiar with since they're, brand new, and they are often some of the best cards you can have if you see them in your opening hand or if you draw them later in the game. So let's jump through them one by one. Starting off, Abstruse Archaic is a 4-cost creature avatar, 3/4 with Vigilance, and it lets you pay 1 and tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability you control from a colorless source. You may choose new targets for the copy. This is actually really good for a lot of reasons. Specifically in a colorless deck, you're running lots of artifacts in order to get your basic value. In blue, you can just run a blue draw spell, but in colorless, you often have to use artifacts or, weird permanents in order to draw you cards. So this essentially allows you to double a lot of your card draw, double your removal, and double just a lot of the value you're getting from the deck in general. Next up is Calamity of the Titans. It's a 6-cost colorless sorcery, and as an additional cost to cast the spell, reveal a colorless creature card from your hand. Then you exile each creature and planeswalker with mana value less than the revealed card's mana value. Overall, it's just a really good board wipe as it lets you be really selective, and if you have a lot of expensive permanents, it may just clear your opponent's entire boards, leaving you with an asymmetrical board wipe. Next up, we have Desecrate Reality, which is a 7-cost instant, and it says, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target permanent that player controls with an even mana value. So this will, in a 4-player game, exile 3 things for 7 mana. But then it has Adamant. If at least 3 colorless mana was spent to cast the spell, return a permanent card with an odd mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. In essence, this is 7 mana to exile 3 things and return the biggest thing from your graveyard to the battlefield. That's just a lot of value, especially in a colorless deck. Next up, Flayer of Loyalties is 8 and 2 colorless for a total of 10 mana for an Eldrazi that's a 10/10. And when you cast it, you get to gain control of target creature an opponent controls, and then it becomes a 10/10 with Trample, Annihilator 2, and Haste. This thing lets you immediately swing in for some devastating damage and make your opponent sacrifice permanents, and then every turn after that, it's a 10/10 with Trample and Annihilator 2. This is just devastating to your opponent's board and can pretty often just win you the game. Next up, Rise of the Eldrazi is a 12-cost sorcery that says this spell can't be countered. It says, destroy target permanent, target player draws 4 cards, take an extra turn after this one, then exile Rise of the Eldrazi. This card is doing everything you want to do, removing stuff, drawing cards, and giving you an extra turn. Yes, it's a 12 drop, but if you can get it off, you get to untap all of your lands and immediately play a bunch of stuff. Plus, whatever you cascade into will basically have haste since you'll be getting an extra turn after it, so it's really powerful with Zuladoc. Next up is Skittering Cicada. It's a 3-cost creature insect 2/2 with flash, and it says you may cast colorless spells as though they had flash. Then whenever you cast a colorless spell until end of turn, Skittering Cicada gains trample and gets +X/+X, where X is that spell's mana value. What this lets you do, since it itself has flash, is that it allows you to flash out anything that's colorless for just 3 more mana than the cost of the thing. Plus, it itself will get big when you cast that, allowing you to do some really defensive blocks, and then the next turn cast a big thing, it becomes big and gains trample, and then you get to kill your opponent with it. This just feels like a lot of value. Next up is Ugin's Mastery. It's a 4-cost enchantment, and it says whenever you cast a colorless creature spell, manifest the top card of your library, which again, we talked about manifest earlier. You put it from the top of your library onto the battlefield face down, and if it's a creature, you can turn it face up for its mana value. Or whenever you attack with a creature with total power 6 or greater, you may turn a face down creature you control face up. So Ugin's Mastery kind of gives you an alternate way to flip your manifest and gives you a repeatable way of essentially drawing cards, which is really great in colorless. And then finally, Darksteel Monolith is an 8-cost artifact with Indestructible, and it says once each turn you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a colorless spell you cast from your hand. The deck is full of really big colorless spells, so not having to pay for them is really great, allowing you to play those big, 12 drops that we were talking about earlier without actually having to pay for them. Now, it's only your first one each turn, but then that leaves all of your mana untapped to then cast a second spell. Alright, so those are the new cards and the commanders from the deck, but let's talk about the deck as a whole, and since we don't have time to talk about every card, we're just going to talk about the stats. First off, there are 13 pieces of removal, which feels pretty good. That's about the number you want to be running to stay competitive in the game. Now, some of this stuff is not efficient, but there are just 13 spells that allow you to take out your opponent's permanents selectively. This does not include things like board wipes. Next up, there are 17 pieces of ramp, and this is really necessary. The whole point of the deck is big spells, and so there are a lot of mana rocks and a lot of ways to generate mana. The other thing to consider, a lot of cards in this deck serve dual purpose because they're often on artifacts. So for example, there's an artifact that's both ramp and you can sacrifice it to remove your opponent's stuff. So it technically falls into both categories, and that's just kind of the nature of having an artifact-based deck for its value. Next up, there are 15 draw spells. Now these aren't all big things, 6 of them are one-time draws and 9 of them allow you to have repeatable value. They're not always exactly draw. I am considering things like Manifest to be a draw spell, since it is putting it on the battlefield, and if it is a creature, you then get to play it. So it is a form of draw, but it's 15 spells that will help you get card advantage, which is pretty good, although a lot of them are really not efficient. Now, those are the main stats of the deck, but there were a couple things I found interesting. The name of the deck is Eldrazi Unbound, but the deck only actually comes with 12 Eldrazi, and it comes with 39 artifacts. So in a lot of ways, this deck feels more like an artifact deck than an Eldrazi deck, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Eldrazi are big and expensive, and so having too many of them would make the deck literally unplayable. But just know that not every spell you cast is going to be on Eldrazi. You'll often set up your future plays with artifacts and then ramp into your Eldrazi's as your finishers. That's just a good mindset to go into. I wasn't sure when they first announced it if it was going to be a deck just full of Eldrazi, or if it was going to be a deck that just had Eldrazi's as a top end, and that's how it is, which I think is the more powerful way to build the deck, so just be aware of that. Now, because of that, it means there aren't a lot of cards that actually care about Eldrazi specifically because there aren't a lot of Eldrazi in the deck. Instead, there are a lot of cards that care about colorless cards mattering. There are 11 cards that care about colorless cards, and because of that, you can get value off of both your artifacts and your Eldrazi. So if you're looking for new cards to add to the deck, look for the ones that specifically care about colorless cards. Speaking of cards you're adding, let's talk about cards you shouldn't be removing from the deck, the ones that are the most powerful and add the most most to the deck. The first one being Mystic Forge. This 4-cost artifact lets you look at the top card of your library and cast artifact and colorless spells from the top of your library. Then you can tap it and pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library to look at something new. This is just a lot of value, a lot of cards drawn, a lot of information gained for just 4 mana. It's one of the most efficient draw spells in the deck, and is something you should really leave alone because it will be a powerhouse every time it's on the battlefield. Next up is Ugin the Ineffable. It's a 6-cost legendary planeswalker that does everything you want. His +1 creates creatures that when they die, draw you a card. His -3 can destroy any permanent that has at least 1 color, and his passive makes all colorless spells cost 2 less to cast, which is really important when you are casting such big stuff. It's just a card that is going to ramp you, create creatures, draw you cards, and destroy your opponent's permanents, which is really everything you're wanting to do. And finally, the best card, the card that will probably change the game every time you play it, Forsaken Monument, is a 5-cost legendary artifact that gives all colorless creatures you control +2/+2, so all of your creatures get +2/+2, and whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana, you add an additional colorless mana, so essentially it doubles all of your mana. Then whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life, so that's the least important one, but it is a nice bonus on there. This essentially doubles your mana and makes your creatures extra big, especially your small little scions or any other incidental colorless creatures you're creating, and it typically just means if you get to untap the next turn, you are gonna win the game because you have doubled your mana. Alrighty, so that's the deck. It's actually really fun and starts with you just playing a bunch of artifacts to get a bunch of value and mana, then playing your commander, and then casting really big colorless spells that turn into even more spells that your opponents just can't deal with. It is a very splashy deck. If you like big creatures and big spells, it's definitely one you should check out, and it has been a blast to mess around with. One of my favorite parts about it is the fact that the land base is not mostly waste. I was a little worried that it was going to be pretty much all waste, but if you look in it, they have a bunch of utility lands that don't normally get included in precons, and it's really nice to see, your lands are doing a little bit more. It's one of the advantages of being in a colorless deck, and they did take advantage of that in this precon. If you're wanting to upgrade this or make your own personal twist on it, just add your favorite big colorless Eldrazi or artifacts, and you can make the deck really your own and upgrade it in little ways. It has a pretty good foundation to support bigger spells, and I think that's a really fun way to build a precon, where you can kind of pick your own top end as you want to add more Eldrazi Titans or cards like Portal to Phyrexia. If you want to learn more about Commander Masters and the precons, check out the link below in the pinned comment and description. There you can learn more about the set and potentially pick one up if you think this deck is for you. There's also 3 other awesome Commander decks that you should also check out. That's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe, and maybe check out one of these awesome videos that YouTube recommends for you. See you guys in the next one. Bye.